Welcome to Composers Play. My name is Scott Tobin. For the last 10 years, I've been composing music for video games, such as Project Reality, Squad, and Postscriptum. The concept of Composers Play was brought on from my passion for video game music. So, join me as I relive, discuss, and get a little nostalgic with the composers of some of the most memorable video game music. Hey everyone, and welcome to Composers Play, where myself and my guests will be playing through some classic video games and chatting about all things music and audio. So, before we get flying and chasing some Kilrathi, joining me on this Composers Play is none other than the original composer of Wing Commander 3, George Oldziey. A veteran in his field, George has a long list of credits to his name, most notably Wing Commander, Ultima 9, Red Faction. He's worked as an orchestrator and additional music on Spy Kids, Kill Bill, Sin City, just to name a few. So hey George, thanks for joining me.
Sure. Oh, anytime. This will be fun.
This is gonna be good. Perfect. So so before we get talking about the Wing Commander, George, how did you get into doing music for video games?
Yeah, it was totally by accident. I that much of a gamer. In 1994, I was looking for a way to make a living because I had a 4-year-old son, and I didn't think the life of a musician would income to raise a family.
Sure.
Actually applied for a job as a health insurance salesman, and
okay.
decided I didn't want to do that. And I just friend, actually a sax player named Paul Baker, who was a composer at Origin at the time, told me, "Oh yeah, I just got this job writing music for video games." I said, "Oh wow, that sounds cool. I'd love to do that."
Yeah.
And together a demo tape, because we didn't have CDs back then.
Mm-hmm.
And so what kind of music? And he said, well, they kind of like, and stuff. And a cassette. And actually, I have to confess, I didn't even know how to use any computer compositional software at the time.
Oh wow.
Went to a friend's house who had Cakewalk, the original Cakewalk for PC.
Yeah.
And it was a sequencer. He had some little Roland sound canvas box that he used for sound, and like a 2-minute thing, and Commander 3, and I had absolutely no idea what I was getting into.
Right. I can imagine.
But I didn't find out till later they actually did a national search for a composer, and I just on a whim.
Right. So it's completely by chance, just the opportunity came up, and then yeah.
And I never told them I'd never written any music for games before.
Yeah, sure, of course.
Such a great title was my first one that really kind of changed my career.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's such a bold soundtrack, isn't it? It's so, I mean, I was looking at the midis, and there's quite a lot of orchestration. There's a lot going on,
Well, that's a good question, because the music in Wing Commander 3 was all MIDI. There wasn't any digital music yet.
Right.
We used the Roland sound canvas as the reference for, how many notes you can have going at any one time, and
right.
And even that only had I believe like 12 notes of polyphony.
Mm-hmm.
Which and sometimes the string like 3 notes. So
right.
So the limitations were pretty severe, and Chris Roberts still wanted something to sound orchestral.
Sure.
It was a challenge, but I was actually pretty lucky. There's a lot of music in that game between the gameplay and the cutscenes, and 2 weeks of submitting demos to Chris, I finally found And from then until the game shipped, there was maybe 1 or 2 times he had me do something over. Everything else was my first.
Wow. So what were the challenges? Like, having your MIDI. Did you go back to your old MIDIs and did you, tidy them up, separate the brass lines and your strings and stuff? Because it's all done on. I know you had it in MIDI. It was all done with one ensemble patches.
Yeah, well, before I used Cakewalk as my sequencer, and when you save a file back then in Cakewalk, you get a file that's a .wrk file.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the only software that can open that now is Sonar.
Right.
So I ended up, luckily I saved all those
right. Okay.
.wrk files, and then I opened up Sonar, and one by one I'd have to. And what made it really tough was those files weren't labeled by names; they were numbers, and I had no numbers for a reference on a cue sheet, and I had no cross-reference about like what cue number 056 was. I had to run in Sonar and say, oh yeah, that's what that is, and then I converted to a MIDI file. When I first came to Origin in '94, each production team had their own audio people and composers, and altogether, I think there were like 12 of us.
Wow.
And but by the time Prophecy came along, we were down to like 4. And and then finally, just before I left, we were told that I would be more of a numbers cruncher, like in terms of not numbers, but they were going to outsource music and sound design, and I can stay to kind of help implement all that. And I thought to myself, I don't want to do that. I want to be the composer.
Yeah, yeah.
So I mentioned to my audio lead, I said, maybe you guys should fire me and hire me as a contract composer. And 20 minutes later, he came back and says, well, you're fired.
Oh, no way.
But no, actually, if I had quit, I wouldn't have been able to collect any
redundancy,
any benefits or severance pay. So they actually gave me like 6 weeks pay and let me buy the equipment at like almost nothing that I had in my studio, because they provided all that for me since I was an employee.
Right. Okay, that's not too bad. Yeah.
So I was able to start with that Kurzweil keyboard and
sure.
Miroslav Vitous sound library.
Oh yeah.
But then over the years, I switched from Cakewalk to Digital Performer on Mac. Actually, I think back then it was Performer, and then Digital Performer.
Right.
And I got Pro Tools for recording and editing audio, and now I've got. Actually, it's kind of cool. I travel back and forth from Austin, Texas, to a little place where I am right now in Los Angeles, and I have everything in a carry-on that I need. I've got a Mac trash can, and with 128 gig of memory, and it's a 6-core.
Nice.
And 4 terabyte Thunderbolt drives that house all my sample libraries and session files, and I've got Vienna Ensemble Pro that I use to host Contact and Play and all the libraries that use that to load. I've got the LA scoring strings, Synphobia, and I subscribed to the East-West Composer Cloud.
Yeah.
And downloaded pretty much their entire catalog.
Wow, that's what must be nearly a terabyte or so, is it? Probably more.
More.
Wow.
I don't use it all, but I figured, I have my favorites, but at least I have the flexibility that if I get put on a project and I need something that I haven't used before. Chances are it's in there somewhere.
Yeah, so I saw your video on the Wing Commander, the making of and the cellist's approach, and I thought that was really nice. And could you explain to me a little bit more about what happened there?
Yeah. Well, obviously, it's very flattering that he approached me for after the recording was finished, and he brought his original copy of Wing Commander 3
Right.
and had me sign it for him. But
That's great.
the reason he was even there was, he was a cellist from Poland, and we recorded in Bratislava. So he wrote to me about 2 months before the recording and asked if he could be. Well, he said he was a big fan of my music and said he would love to play in the orchestra that
Sure.
recorded the music. And I had no idea if he was any good or not. I said, well, where do you play? And he sent me a list of several orchestras in both Poland and Germany, actually.
Wow.
And I researched those orchestras, and they were fine orchestras. And I saw a concert program listing where his name was actually in the section. So I just assumed he's probably good enough.
Right.
And so I wrote to the contractor who hired the musicians for the recording and said, well, there'll be a extra cellist playing with the orchestra. And he said, fine, we'll set up an extra chair and music stand. And so the day of the recording came around, and I was in the booth doing last minute preparation while the orchestra was warming up and tuning, and the contractor just happened to say, well, you have heard that cellist play before, haven't you? And I said, no. And he thought I was nuts. And then he said, well, you know him personally, right? I said, no, I've never met him before. Both he and the conductor kind of looked at each other, and I said, well, look, the first cue we're doing starts with cellos, and we'll know within a few bars whether he's any good. And if he's not, we'll just stop the recording and ask him to sit on the sidelines.
Okay.
But he turned out to be a fine player, and
oh wow.
Now they actually call him to do recording from time to time.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, it's a lovely moment. When I was watching it, I was like, that's great, 24 years later, he still has the original box, and and he meets you.
Yeah,
it's really cool.
That really warmed my heart. At the end of that video, I mentioned, I was almost getting teary-eyed about the fact that
Sure.
when I wrote all this music, the deadlines were happening so fast and furiously that not really in the moment in terms of thinking about the impact of it. And I had no idea until years later how much it meant to so many people. And in some ways, if I never do anything else again, that's really, I think, going to be my legacy as a musician, to have we don't all get the opportunity to reach out to so many people. And obviously the game gave me that opportunity, and it was probably the highlight of my compositional career.
Wow. It's great. We'll talk about Star Citizen. Were you approached at all by Chris Roberts to do the music for that?
Yeah, back when they were first developing the concept and looking to raise some money, they asked me to compose some music for the trailer that they would play at E3, and I think they actually used some other of my music for gameplay, rudimentary gameplay. They were just starting to develop.
Right.
And I kind of assumed that perhaps this would be an opportunity to work with Chris again. And he lives in Los Angeles. At the time, I wasn't commuting back and forth from LA yet, but I was out in LA, and got together with him for lunch, and we were just chatting about the old times. And I said, well, do you think you want to use me for Star Citizen? And he kind of gave me this look like, well, your music modulates too much. It's not really what we're
Oh,
looking
jeez.
for.
Oh no.
And I said, well, I can change it.
Right, yeah, to
um,
whatever you want, yeah.
but yeah, long story short, I think he just wanted to go a different direction, and yeah, I have no hard feelings about it. But I would have, of course,
Mm-hmm.
loved the opportunity. But I can't tell you how many Wing Commander fans have written to me and asked me why I wasn't
Yeah,
writing
absolutely.
the music for Star Citizen. I said, why don't you write to Chris Roberts and ask him?
Yeah, yeah,
I,
absolutely.
but I've heard some of the music they have, and I think it's great. I think Pedro Camacho is doing a lot of it,
Mm-hmm.
and he's a fine composer.
Yeah. I mean,
And,
the one thing I like about the Wing Commander music is that it modulates a lot. It's never your ear doesn't never get tired.
yeah, actually, it's I teach I think I mentioned I teach some classes at the LA College of Music, and sometimes I've actually given some of those pieces as an assignment for my students to figure out what the harmonic progressions are in there, because it's not like D minor for 2 minutes, like a
Yeah,
lot of stuff you hear
yeah,
in the films. It's I'm not saying it's any better. It's just a different style that I personally feel kind of keeps the energy moving forward.
definitely, yeah. Because like I was listening to it, and like you're going from like different scales. You're going from different minor chords to you're going like minor to other minor, to A flat minor, and then there's other chords where you're going to to D major, and then you're using the sharp 5, the arpeggiated.
Yeah, you got good ears.
Yeah, it's lovely. Yeah, but it's wonderful, and I love that. It's just because it's a space game, but it's quite fast and everything. There's so much energy, and it really it suits the game.
Yeah, and this is the first time I've thought of this. I was hearing you talk about that. I'm thinking, when did I come up with that?
Yeah.
And how? I remember the first few weeks I worked at Origin. I was looking for a sound that Chris Roberts would like, and there was one. I forget the very first thing he liked. It was. Well, anyway, it was like that, where I think I started in D minor, then I went to B flat minor, and then there's a lot of relationships of thirds.
Yeah, composing in thirds.
And and he loved it, and I'm like, oh great. So then I just kind of use that as a template, not that specific progression, but just I started getting a little more adventurous in terms of, well, what would it sound like if I went to this chord here? And so what tied that all together is I first came up with the melodies.
Right.
And I tried to come up with a harmony, like in certain part of the melody, that it was unexpected. And I thought that's what would kind of keep the music moving forward. If you always go to some place that's expected, it can get a little dull.
Right.
So I guess that was my whole reasoning behind it, and then it just kind of evolved from there. I didn't really get hired with that sound in mind. If I send you my demo, it wouldn't sound anything like
Right. Yeah.
the music that ended up in the game. But nobody wants it anymore.
Your new project now has the bar music, all the jazz, bossa nova type genres. So and you have that all recorded.
Yeah.
That's great. I'm looking forward to hearing that.
I promise within a few months I'll have that ready for everybody.
That's great. Yeah, because I'm actually enjoying a nice Scotch whiskey here while we're sitting in the bar. So
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah,
that's a little too early for me.
yeah, 12 o'clock. I guess might be a bit wrong.
Yeah, well, yeah. I'd be toast the rest of the day.
So yeah, the last thing I want to touch on is like, thank you for doing the funding for Wing Commander and getting the orchestra to play it, and I think it's a really cool thing keeping this music alive, and I've talked with other composers on Composers Play about how important it is keeping all this old music alive.
Yeah, well, thank you because, and I have to thank, it's really the fans that contributed to the fundraising that are the heroes. I mean, I'm happy to do this. I mean, goodness sakes, it's not often you get your music recorded by a real orchestra.
Yeah, definitely.
And have people believe in you enough to support you to do that. That was one of the most, heartwarming, flattering things of my life is, and then makes you want to do the best you possibly can for all those people that had so much faith in you.
Definitely.
So I would thank them more than me.
Yeah, sure. But it's really wonderful, and it's the more I do these and the more I talk to other composers and yourself, and it's just, I don't know, I think it's really important just to keep this, keep this music alive, and I'm glad that you're doing another session with all this, the other music and everything. So it's it's fantastic.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, it makes life worth living, that's for sure.
Absolutely.